So we are carrying on with our faith series today, and I'll give you the title, so grace to God. We are going to be talking today about the faith of Abraham. And I want to start with this. I want to ask you a question. Have you ever been asked to do something that maybe in the natural just didn't make sense to you? Maybe you were asked to, we're not just talking about sort of stepping out of your comfort zone, which is one thing, but maybe you just think, God, why have you asked me to do that? That is just crazy. And we'll kind of come back to this in a minute, because there were people in the Bible that we've been looking at that God has to do crazy things for God. You know, it wasn't long ago that Diane was talking about Noah and the faith of Noah and the faith of a guy who was asked to build an ark when he didn't know what an ark was, and he didn't know what rain was, and he didn't understand what a boat was probably. So how do we handle being asked to do things that in the natural make no sense at all? I've never been asked to build an ark. Nothing as crazy as that. But God has, over the years, challenged me to do things that maybe in the natural didn't make sense. Quite a few years ago, when I had made the decision that I was going to quit my teaching job, and I was going to go and do my training with AOG to become a minister. I made the decision to step out of that career, which was a good career. It was well paying. In fact, if we think back to sort of pre-Grace, or Grace being very little, I love Irish Grace now, we were both heads of department at secondary schools. With that comes quite a good salary, and we were told by God to both quit our jobs, and Diane left teaching and I left teaching, and as you know, because we've talked about it before, I started doing some web design work to try and bring some money in, and in the very early days of doing that, money was really, really tight. And I want to just tell you a short story, because there was one time when God really challenged our faith and stretched our faith. We were really struggling. We'd got no money in the bank, and we were struggling to buy food at the time, and there were stories of people kind of bringing parcels of food to our door when we were struggling. But I want to tell you the time when God really challenged me, and that was when some good friends of ours in a church in Nottingham were putting on a women's event, and they phoned up Joe and they said, we've got this women's event, we've got no drummer, we need a drummer for our women's event. And Joe dropped me a message saying, would you be able to go over to Nottingham and play drums for this women's event they're putting on? And I felt really torn, because one, I love drumming, two, I love serving God, but the problem was, three, we had absolutely no money. And we prayed about it, and we said, God, we just got to do this. And we looked at the amount of money that was in the bank, which was not enough to pay for petrol. And we looked at what money, we went and started the car up and looked at what petrol was in the car. And I worked out that we'd got enough money to get to Nottingham, but we'd not got enough petrol in the tank to get home again. And we said, you know what, God, we're just going to do it, and we're just going to trust you that you're going to figure it out for us. And we did that, and we drove over, and we had enough money to get there. We got there on time. Diane came along with me, so she came just to attend the women's conference, and the event went well. And towards the end of that, we were there going, God, I don't know. We'd not mentioned it to anybody that we had no money to get home again. But we got towards the end of the day, from what I remember, certainly after lunch, and someone came over to us from the event and said, look, we just really feel that God says we want to bless you, and they gave us some money, and it was enough money for us to basically go to the petrol station at the end of the event, put some petrol in the car, and drive back home again. And we told them the story, said, look, we just want to share this with you, that actually we didn't have enough money in the bank to get home again after this, and we just trusted that God was going to sort it out. We just want to say thank you for giving us the money. And do you know what? First of all, that made no sense in the natural, because you wouldn't start something that you couldn't afford to finish. In the reality in God's kingdom is we start things around church all the time that we can't afford to finish, because we believe God is going to provide for us after that time. God asks us to do things that don't make sense. And there's a story in God asking me to do something that doesn't make sense in the provision of finance to get us home, which is a great story and a great anecdote to bring, especially when we're talking about giving to God, because do you know what? God is faithful.
Yeah.
But more than that, sometimes God does miraculous things in the middle of our steps of faith.
Yeah.
And we decided, after having Grace, Diane decided that we were never going to have any more kids.
No.
Just without going into details, somebody who wasn't the most straightforward pregnancy. So we decided, and in the middle of trusting God in this step of faith, someone actually came to Diane who wasn't meant to be there, but decided to come along with me because I'd offered to drum, and had a word from God that Diane would have another child. And after that, Diane got pregnant. We had Josiah. So in the middle of God asking me to do something that made no sense, came two provisions of blessing. One in a blessing of finance, and two in actually God speaking to us in a way that maybe he couldn't have done, or in the way that where we were at, it needed taking Diane out of the situation that she was in into a place where she was with different people for God to actually speak in a different way.
That's right.
And God is amazing like that. And our faith actually means trusting God when things don't always make sense. People set off on journeys in the Bible when they didn't know the destination. People built arks when they didn't understand what rain was. Over the last few weeks, we've been looking at Hebrews chapter 11, where it lists different people that have demonstrated faith. And the first verse says this. This is Hebrews 11, 1-3. Now faith is confidence in what we hope for, and assurance about what we do not see. This is what the ancients were commended for. By faith, we understand that the universe was formed at God's command, so that what is seen was not made out of what was visible. And it goes on. We're not going to read the whole thing today, just for lack of time, but we're continuing today to look at somebody else in that passage in Hebrews 11. And we're going to go straight into it. In Hebrews 11, we're going to skip forward to verse 17. We're going to look at verses 17 through to 19. Because it says this: by faith, Abraham, when God tested him, offered Isaac as a sacrifice. He who had embraced the promises was about to sacrifice his one and only son, even though God had said to him, "It's through Isaac that your offspring will be reckoned." Abraham reasoned that God could even raise the dead, and so in a manner of speaking, he did receive his Isaac back from the dead. So in the list of people that showed and demonstrated their faith, we have this guy who offered his son to be a sacrifice to God, which in the natural didn't make sense, but actually was God's plan, and we'll look at that in a moment. I think to understand this story, we need to understand a little bit about where it happened. So we're going to read through the passage together, because this is a reference back to a story that's told in Genesis. And what I'm going to do is this. My message is going to be structured like this. I want to tell you three important things that we need to know about this story. And then I'm going to follow up with three things that Abraham and his faith teaches us that we can apply into our lives today. So we're going to read through the passage together, but I want to start with this. Number one, God makes big promises. In Genesis 17, and I've not put all these verses on. Genesis 17, 1-8. When Abraham was 99 years old, the Lord appeared to him, saying, "I'm the God Almighty, live in my presence and be blameless. I will set up my covenant between me and you, and I will multiply you greatly." Then Abraham fell face down, and God spoke with him. "As for me, here is my covenant with you. You will become the father of many nations. Your name will no longer be Abraham. Your name will be Abraham. For I will make you the father of many nations. I will make you extremely fruitful, and will make nations and kings come from you. I will confirm my covenant that is between me and you and your future offspring throughout their generations. It's a permanent covenant to you to be your God and the God of your offspring after you. And to you and your future offspring I will give the land where you are residing, all the land of Canaan, as a permanent possession, and I will be their God. Notice twice in that passage it uses the word permanent, a permanent covenant or permanent promise between God and Abraham. And he also gives them a land which he said will permanently be your land. God made a covenant, a promise with Abraham. He said that he would be the father of many nations. He was told that kings would come from his descendants, his family line. And God even goes as far as to say, this promise with you, this is permanent. That's a big promise. God makes a big promise to Abraham. He doesn't just promise that he'll have a son. He promises that he'll have generation after generation of descendants that will populate an entire land. God makes big promises. Second thing I want to tell you is this: God makes impossible promises. Because to make it more interesting, Abraham's wife couldn't have kids. She was too old. In Genesis 18, 9 to 15, a little bit later on, it says this: "Where's your wife Sarah?" they asked him. "There in the tent," he answered. The Lord said, "I'll certainly come back to you in about a year's time, and your wife Sarah will have a son." Now Sarah was listening at the entrance of the tent behind him. Abraham and Sarah were getting on in years. Sarah had passed the age of childbearing. So she laughed to herself, "After I'm worn out and my Lord is old, will I have delight?" But the Lord asked Abraham, "Why did Sarah laugh? Saying, can I really have a baby when I'm this old? Is anything impossible to God? At the appointed time, I will come back to you, and in about a year, she'll have a son." And I love how this passage finishes, because it says this: Sarah denied it. "I didn't laugh," she said, because she was afraid. But he replied, "No, you did laugh." God makes impossible promises. Not only does he make big promises, but his promises in the natural seem like they could never happen. Maybe God has made a promise to you that in the natural seems impossible. But in God's kingdom, all things are possible. Sarah found it funny that God had promised her a child, because in the natural it was impossible, because she couldn't have children and she was past the age of being able to have children. It was an impossible and unbelievable situation. Maybe God has made a promise like that to you. And maybe it's unbelievable because you are too. And then you insert your own reason there. Too old, too young, too poor, too stupid, not good enough. Whatever it might be, God makes promises to us that in the natural seem impossible. But as we know from God, all things are possible. And the third thing we can get from this is God makes unseen promises. God makes promises that you can't see yet. And the last part that I want to read is Genesis 22, and I might skim through bits of this. It's 1 through to 18, because this is the bit that we're looking at. It says, after these things, God tested Abraham. So after this promise that he's made, after this big promise, after he's made a promise about Sarah being able to conceive, after this, it says, after these things, Abraham said to him, "Abraham, here I am. Take your son." So he's now had his son. "Your only son Isaac, who you love. Go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains I tell you about." So Abraham got up early in the morning, saddled his donkey and took him with two of his young men and his son Isaac. He split wood for a burnt offering and set out to go to the place God had told him about. On the third day, Abraham looked up and saw the place in the distance. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey. The boy and I will go over there to worship. Then we'll come back to you." And Abraham took the burnt offering and laid it on his son Isaac. In his hand he took the fire and the knife, and the two of them walked together. Then Isaac said to him, "My father, here I am, son. The fire and the wood are here, but where's the lamb for the burnt offering?" And Abraham said, "God himself will provide the lamb for the burnt offering." Then the two of them walked on together. When they arrived at the place, Abraham built the altar, arranged the wood, bound his son, placed him on the altar on top of the wood, and Abraham reached out and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called out to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham!" He replied, "Here I am." Then he said, "Don't lay a hand on the boy or ask or do anything to him. For now I know that you fear God, since that you've not withheld your only son from me." And then he says this, Abraham looked up and saw a ram caught in the thicket by its horns. So he went, took the ram and offered it as a burnt offering. And Abraham named that place, "The Lord will provide." And then the angel comes down to him, and a few verses on it says, "Because you have done this thing and have not withheld your only son, I will indeed bless you and make your offspring as numerous as the stars in the sky and the sand on the seashore. Your offspring will possess the city gates of their enemies, and all the nations of the earth will be blessed by your offspring, because you have obeyed my command." Abraham's faith was so big that he was willing to sacrifice his own son. Not only something so precious to him, because he loved his son, the thought of me sacrificing my own children, knowing how much I love them, would be such a painful thing. But also, he's doing that knowing that God has made a permanent promise that he will bless Abraham through his descendants. So in the natural, it made absolutely no sense to sacrifice his son. Because in the natural, how then could God fulfill the promise that he's made when the one thing that is needed to fulfill that promise is a descendant of him? How could God fulfill that if his descendant was taken away? And the fact that God not only said that, but he said this promise is permanent. It made no sense at all. So what can we learn from the story about Abraham's faith? I want to say this. Faith means trusting God even when it doesn't make sense. And if there's one thing that you take away remembering today, remember this. Faith means trusting God even when it makes no sense. So I said I just want to share 3 things with you that Abraham did, or Abraham demonstrated in his faith of God. And the first one is this. Abraham embraced the promise even when the reality looked different. Abraham held on to that promise that God had made, even when what he'd been asked to do seemed like totally the opposite of what he thought God was going to do. Have you ever been in that situation where maybe God's told you that he's going to do something and you think, brilliant, I know how God's going to do that. He's going to do X, Y, Z. And then by the time he's done all these things, I'll be where God said I'm going to be. And then what God does is ask us to do something in totally the opposite direction. Something that seems contrary to what God has promised us. I want to challenge you with this. If you're holding on to a promise from God, hold on to the promise, not your vision of the expected reality. Because sometimes God outworks his promises in ways that are different to how we think he's going to do things. Has God given you a promise but you're not yet living in that reality? Maybe God promised you healing but you're still living in sickness and pain. Maybe God promised you breakthrough but you're still waiting for it. Maybe God promised you a job but you're still unemployed. Maybe God promised you a husband or a wife and yet you're still single. Embrace the promise. Don't get caught up in the current reality. The second thing is this. Abraham obeyed God even when it was painful. When Abraham was asked to sacrifice his son on the altar, that would have been a heartbreaking thing to agree to do. I look at that story and I think, what was going on in Abraham's mind at that moment? Did Abraham think that God was going to make him go through with it? Did Abraham think that God was going to intervene? It's interesting that on the way up the mountain, when his son says, you've got all the other stuff for the altar, but where's the sacrifice? And he says, God's going to provide it. Yeah. What was going on in Abraham's head at that point? Was he being polite because he didn't want to say, come on son, you're the sacrifice? Or was he looking to God thinking, God, you've asked me to do this, but I don't understand it, so I'm just going to trust that you're going to figure this out, and I don't really know what it's going to look like. I don't know. I don't know what was going on in Abraham's head at the time. But I know this. I know that he was expectant, and I know that the process was long. It wasn't God says, Danny, can you just do this? And you go, done. It was, Abraham, you're going to do this. By the way, to do this, there's going to be some preparation involved. And we're told the story of the preparation. He gets 2 people. He gets a donkey. He gets the wood. He's clearly got other things ready. He travels. He leaves the two others. He says, we're going off this way. He goes up. He builds the altar. There are multiple steps over a period of time that God walks Abraham through to the point where Abraham is expected to do the one thing that God actually asked him to do. Yeah. There was preparation. God waited until he'd gone through all of those steps and he picked up the knife before God said, stop. Yeah. I want to suggest to you that if you're waiting for God to intervene in your situation or waiting for a fulfillment of a promise he's made, maybe God is waiting for you to take that one last step. Before God comes in and fulfills his promise and rescues you. Imagine if Abraham had gone through all of those steps, got the wood together, got the altar, got my son, got the donkey, got the people, travelled there, left the people there, gone up there, got that, built the altar, and maybe he got to the point where all he got left to do was pick up the knife. And he said, God, I've done enough here. I've done all this. I've done that, I've done that, I've done that. I've got to this point. I'm fed up of it. God doesn't listen to me. God doesn't answer my prayers. I'm stopping here. Imagine knowing with hindsight all these steps that Abraham had to go through, and 95% of the way there he goes, I've had enough of this, God. Yeah. We can be tempted to quit without realising that we're almost at the end of the journey that God is taking us on. Yeah. Maybe you're partway through a long journey of waiting for God to fulfill his promises. And I want to encourage each one of us to keep going. Hold on to the promise, persevere with what God's asked us to do, and not give up. Yeah. Faith tells us to keep going because breakthrough could be just around the next corner. And the last thing I want to tell you is this. Abraham was blessed by God because he trusted. Abraham made it to the fulfillment of the promise because he had faith during the journey. Then the angel of the Lord called to Abraham a second time from heaven and said, By myself I have sworn. This is the Lord's declaration. Because you have done this thing and not withheld your only son, I will indeed bless you and make your offspring as numerous as the stars of the sky. If you're still in the dark and difficult part of your situation, the difficult part of your journey, then trust in God, because breakthrough is coming. God will fulfill his promises. The Bible says that anything that God speaks, nothing will return unfulfilled. God blessed Abraham, and this story is a great example of encouragement to persevere even in difficult times. We sang that song earlier. I'm just going to invite Harry up as I'm talking for a minute. And he says this: I know breakthrough is coming. By faith I see a miracle. My God made me a promise, and it won't stop now. I think the words of that song perfectly capture what we can learn from Abraham in this story. For our own lives, I know that breakthrough is coming. By faith, I see a miracle. My God made me a promise, and it won't stop now. We should trust in God. We should embrace the promise even when the reality looks different. We should obey God even when it's painful. And when we do that, God blesses us because we trust in him. So I want to encourage you to keep going, to trust in God, even when it seems difficult, even when it seems like the reality of your promise is unseen. Even when what you're asked to do doesn't make sense. Because right around the corner is the fulfillment of the promise that God has in store for you.